let me try to frame the conversation here. Let me get to my notes for a second. First, I want to thank both of you for taking part in this conversation sponsored by Puntorojo. We appreciate it. The occasion for our conversation today is last week at Rutgers University, 2 bargaining units of faculty voted by 90% to strike. The 2 respective bargaining units are the Rutgers AAUP-AFT, which is American Association of University Professors and American Federation of Teachers, which represents full-time faculty, graduate workers, postdoctoral associates, and counselors. And the second bargaining unit is a Rutgers Adjunct Faculty Union representing part-time lecturers. The call for a strike was for the administration to do several things, including recognizing a single bargaining unit that negotiates for full-time faculty, adjunct faculty, and colleagues in medical schools that were absorbed into the Rutgers system. The unions are also calling for a living wage for graduate workers and non-tenure full-time faculty to have increased job security. In addition to a call for an annual raise across the board for faculty. It's a pretty momentous occasion, both for Rutgers and higher ed, the potentiality of a strike. It would be the first time in the 250-odd year history of Rutgers that faculty will strike. And it would affect all 3 campuses, Rutgers, Camden, and Newark, Rutgers, Newark, and Rutgers, Campden, Newark, and New Brunswick campuses. So it's a big deal, and we're really grateful that 2 of the members of the bargaining units have decided to join us today to talk about what the strike means and why they think it's a potential, and also what it feels like to be on the ground now in the middle of a possible historic strike at Rutgers. So we're talking with Erin Santana, who's a doctoral candidate in American Studies at Rutgers Newark. She studies the role of history telling in struggles for educational justice. Prior to grad school, Erin worked in museums, historic sites, and public high schools in Brooklyn. And she also serves on the union's executive committee, the graduate steering committee, and the political education committee. And she'll be joined by Sebastian León, who is a 5th-year assistant professor of Latino and Caribbean Studies and Criminal Justice at Rutgers, New Brunswick, where he also serves as an elective member of the AAUP-AFT Executive Council. And his work specializes in the relationship between formal social control and state corporate power, both within and beyond formal criminal justice systems. So really happy to have a chance to talk with you both tonight. Thanks for being here. I thought I would start by just asking if you could tell me in your own words why you think you're at this place at Rutgers on the verge of a possible strike. Erin, do you want to start off, and then maybe we can go to Sebastian?
Sure. Thanks so much for having us. I mean, I think that we're on the verge of a strike for the reason that most higher education unions and universities are on the verge of a strike if their contracts are up right now, as well as folks in other industries. You know, we're just in a moment where employers are trying to squeeze labor as much as possible, and workers have gained in consciousness, I think, over the last several years for a variety of reasons, and are not willing to put up with it anymore. And so that's where we're at Rutgers.
Thank you, Bill. Echoing Erin, thank you for sharing your time with us and on covering this important issue. So the question on why we're on the verge of a faculty strike is, it brings up a lot of different things, but one of them is simply that at the bargaining table, management has engaged in all of the usual tactics and I don't mean to be pejorative by calling them tricks, but in the tactics of delaying, slowing down, bringing up extraneous or side issue matters as part of a process that, to echo what Erin said, is to squeeze as much as they can and to be out of contract for as long as they possibly can. And so in the absence of any serious threat to the stability of the corporate enterprise, which would come in the form of a strike, that process would extend for as long as possible. And it's kind of like, the 1,000-cut type of analogy, but also it's hard to reduce everything to one exact factor, but it's kind of like the econometric analyses of corporations during this inflationary period, that in some part, prices are raised simply because they can be, and corporate profits and profiteering is at an all-time high, while inflation is also high. And it really mirrors the strategy by management to get as much as they can for as long as they can by making the contract campaign last, in perpetuity. If they could have it their way, we'd be, quote unquote, in negotiation for 400, 500, 800, 1,200 days, and they'd be just as happy. In fact, their management's bargaining team would be rewarded for pulling off such a feat. So we're really on the verge of a strike, not because we want to be, but because it's because we have to be. Otherwise, we'll be caught in this state of limbo in perpetuity.
That's great. So I've been following your AAUP, campaigning for the strike, and I know that the union has noted that the Rutgers has been running, I think, the largest operating surpluses in a long time. I mean, on the order of hundreds of millions of dollars. So talk a little bit about what that looks like if you're, say, a graduate student worker, basically just trying to make ends meet, or, in your case, Sebastian, a faculty member who also is feeling, as you put it, all of this kind of crisis and pinch that the economy is forcing on workers everywhere. What's the cognitive dissonance like, right? To see the university basically so flush with money, but not willing to actually, create a fair share.
I think it's demoralizing in different ways. Independent from the contract campaign and the current, labor-specific context, part of our jobs, both consciously and subconsciously, involves articulating our instrumental worth as human beings and as laborers, intellectual laborers, to the university at every step. So we end up translating a lot of what we do, or we're nudged or encouraged or formally incentivized and rewarded even for doing things like saying, look at how this new pedagogical approach results in increased enrollments, which is really increased, dollar signs, or look at how many meetings there are available with an office that specializes in moving you through the patenting and commercialization process. Or, there's no shortage of examples of being made to feel like a cog in the machine, where the emphasis is on bringing in money, bringing in prestige, and bringing in as many dollar signs as you can. When you see so explicitly what Rutgers claims to have money for and not have money for, it becomes particularly insulting, because you have all of these various pyramids where the bases are much larger than the top, than the pinnacle. And if we don't pay attention to it, we find ourselves almost in a zero-sum competition. This exists within departments, between departments, within cohorts of graduate students, with their funding packages, within adjuncts, worried about the negative customer service Yelp style, Google Map style review on their evaluations to see if they'll be renewed for another year, for another semester. And so when you pair that with the kind of free, limitless spending on certain things like athletics, things that are known to be money pits, known to be losers economically speaking, it just adds insult to injury. you almost have to remind yourself that like there are parts of a university that cannot follow some like user fee model or some, pay for the service type model, say like a library, or like the mere premise of graduate students being funded to advance their education. And then other things are more, department specific, where there's a big emphasis on peer institutions, and many graduate programs are falling behind in terms of what they can offer to graduate students to be competitive. And that over time will result in losing some of the best and brightest grad students to other programs, because Rutgers has the money but chooses not to invest in its academic mission and in its research mission. And that's a shame. It's truly a shame.
Yeah, building off of that, I would say that the absurdities in terms of the gaps between who makes what amount of money, I think renders very clear how the university, in spite of its talk about particularly Rutgers, particularly Newark campus where I'm at, talks a lot about its diversity and trying to, be a public university for all of the people of New Jersey, whatnot. But the ways in which they compensate graduate workers make it very clear that you have to be somewhat independently wealthy in order to be a full-time graduate student. And I think that it's important for people to understand that graduate students are workers. This is our full-time job. You can do graduate school part-time while you have a full-time job. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about people whose full-time job is doing graduate work. That work includes teaching, it includes research, right? It's all the same types of work that faculty members do. We're doing it, of course, at a level in which we're in the process, being trained, but it is still our full-time job. And the university certainly profits off of all of that labor. So currently the minimum TAGA, which is the teaching assistant, graduate assistant salary, is $30,000. That is well below a living wage in the New York metro area, which is where Newark campus is. And many people in New Brunswick also live in the New York City metro area. The living wage in this area is calculated by MIT is $47,000. So $30,000 is well below that. And that's for a childless individual. So, if you're talking about people who have any sort of dependence, forget about it, trying to survive off of $30,000 a year. And so people end up doing, second and third jobs just to make ends meet, even though technically our contracts even state in some cases, and the legality of this is contested, but in some cases our appointment letters state that we are not supposed to even have other jobs because they want us to be dedicating all of our time to, this labor. But then they will only pay us $30,000. And that's what we negotiated in the last contract campaign. It was, I think, 26 or 27 when I started 6 years ago. And our demand in this contract campaign is for it to go up to 41 after 4 years. So we say we're demanding a living wage for grad workers because that's a good catchphrase, but we're not even. We're demanding, certainly 4 years from now, will be even less of a living wage, right, with inflation at the rate it is. Meanwhile, we know, forget about the $4 million football coach salary, and there's multiple coaches that also make in the millions of dollars. But Robert Barchi, who is the former president, he gets a six-figure salary for, I don't know what kind of labor he is providing. I think it's just for being the former president. And he gets six figures, for what? And so, this idea that you can't pay people who are doing a full-time job at the very least enough to just pay rent and pay your bills and eat, meanwhile, you're willing to pay people 6 and 7 figures, to do labor that's either secondary to the mission of the university or maybe no labor at all. It's just tremendously insulting. And then to see, the negotiations dragged on and on and on. And we know, given, you gave some of the financial figures, but that to give all of the graduate workers, which, there's only 1,700 of us or so represented by the contract. We are also demanding recognition for people who are on fellowships, which is another way the university saves money by paying people even less and giving even less healthcare. So I'm currently on a fellowship, so I actually only make $25,000 a year. And my health insurance is about 5 times as more expensive to me. 5 times more comes out of my pocket than the health insurance I had when I was covered by the bargaining unit. So, they're just squeezing us for pennies, and we know they have it. We know they have it. And so the more you learn about these dynamics, the more you really understand how it is not about being able to afford it, which is constantly the university's message, right? The president just sent a message out in response to our latest, action a few weeks ago to the whole university about how, woe is him, we just can't afford it. We know that's factually inaccurate. We know they could afford it many, many times over. And it's really about this principle about maintaining control over labor and minimizing wages. And we see this even, all these tech companies are laying off thousands of people. We know they don't need to do that right now. They're doing that because it makes their stock price go up. And so there's this willingness to just really play with people's lives and livelihoods in the interests of generating profit for people who are fine. People who can pay their bills multiple times over. If anything, they're worried about paying the mortgage on their 5th house or their yacht or something like that. I mean, really, I'm not making it up. That's the level of wealth that we're talking about. And those folks are trying to just squeeze people who are, trying to just make ends meet on a daily basis.
Yeah, absolutely. The kind of, where I'm working here in Indiana, the, housing costs have just skyrocketed for students, and the daily grind of living has been really excruciating. And I wanted both of you to talk a little bit about this, this kind of one big union, strategy that you're forging there, which is to make the university recognize a single bargaining unit that it would include part-time lecturers, because I think if you work in a university, you realize one of the obstacles to solidarity is all the tiers of workers, right, that get created. So can you talk a little bit about that strategy, how it's going, why it's so important? I think there's something for other faculty unions to kind of benefit from in thinking about this. Could either of you talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, one of our PTL comrades wasn't able to join us. And PTL at Rutgers stands for part-time lecturer, which is known as an adjunct in a lot of places. And, in some cases, I would say, not that there's necessarily a need to compare, but that the material situation that adjuncts face is even more precarious than graduate workers, because for many of them, it's their full-time gig, in perpetuity, right? The way that the position of the adjunct was set up was sort of as, oh, again, this is someone who has a job and they're just teaching a class on the side. That's not how it works anymore at most universities. You have a huge percentage of classes taught by part-time lecturers whose entire livelihood is teaching classes either at Rutgers, at a bunch of different campuses, or at a bunch of different universities cobbled together. They don't get health insurance generally from any of these institutions, and they also are making maybe $40,000, $50,000 at the end of the day, which again is barely living wage, especially if you live in the New York metro area. And so, these are folks that are teaching the same classes that full-time faculty are teaching. Students don't know the difference. We actually had a whole campaign last semester, to expose, right, and demystify that for students, hey, a lot of your professors are actually adjuncts and are making so much less than, another professor who, for the student, it's the absolute same difference, or no difference at all. And so this, again, is just a tactic from management, right, to get the same amount of labor for way, way, way less money. And by having these different categories, right, so you have full-time faculty that teach, you have non-tenure track faculty that teach, they make a little less, you have adjuncts that teach, they make even less, you have graduate workers that teach, they also make very little, and you can move people around between these categories. I mean, once you're on a faculty track, I guess good for you, you're hopefully going to stay there. But, especially between graduate workers and part-time lecturers, people often we're actually, some of us are in both units because you can't live necessarily off of the graduate worker salary. You also do an adjunct class and things like that. Or if they run out of funding for you as a graduate worker, then, you know, your friendly program director will find you a couple adjunct classes to teach, you know, so that you can, you know, afford to finish your degree. And so it's a way that they are able to, again, you know, divide people, mystify what's going on, confuse things. And I think what's most important from, again, the student perspective is they're just all the professors. And so you see how the actual work that's required, if you're teaching a class, you're teaching a class. It's the same amount of work. You could have a PhD and have tenure. You could not have tenure yet. You could be an adjunct. You could be a graduate worker. It takes the same amount of labor to teach a class. And so one of our major demands, right, is equal pay for equal work, which is that everyone that teaches a class should make the same amount of money for teaching a class, period. And the way this is manifest in the PTL demands is through what we call fractional appointments, where essentially, you know, if you're teaching one class, then you would make the same fraction of what a full-time faculty member would get for one class. And so yeah, so I think that the vision of all bargaining as one unit is to, again, make it harder for management to you know, to make these lines and divide us up. And obviously, as workers, it just makes our power greater. The great thing about this campaign is that we're acting as if, right, we're functioning as one unit. And we've even been going to bargaining sessions as one unit, and even certain things have been kind of written on like the same piece of paper, which some of these things become, you know, significant symbolically in these types of negotiations. So I can't say with any surety the fate of our demand to bargain as one unit, but I can say with absolute certainty that we're acting as one unit, and that's what's giving us a lot of the power that we have right now in our negotiations.
That's great.
Thank you so much, Erin. Yeah. The only thing I have to add is the phrase equal pay for equal work. It can be, in certain contexts, incredibly generous and charitable to full-time tenure stream faculty, because what can happen sometimes is that your non-tenure track and your part-time or adjunct faculty actually do way more for the department in ways both measurable and immeasurable. Once you're in the tenure stream, and if you're of the statistically few, and there's a whole different discussion to be had on the myth of a meritocracy about securing a tenure track job. But to get back to the point, once you're in the tenure stream, and if you're associate or full, you have every reason, incentive, and ability to avoid teaching the most labor-intensive classes. More importantly, the most high enrollment introductory level courses. And those are carried on the backs of your doctoral students, your adjuncts, your PTLs, who really over time, but most importantly as a community, as a worker class, make or break what a department can be and will be. Because the entrance funnel, that first year class or that writing intensive class, students will learn to enjoy or not enjoy the material based on that experience. And so there are so many parts of university life that are siloed and compartmentalized to prevent seeing the common plight and the kind of interdependency between these faculty groups. So to Erin's point, there's, I guess the campaign hashtag would be one faculty that we've been working on for well over a year, where it took, you know, a merger card campaign to make that unequivocally clear, and those merger cards were delivered to President Holloway. But students benefit significantly from this solidarity across different groups, and those faculty in the most privileged positions benefit significantly. It's not like a sympathetic view that your most privileged faculty have, but really an existential one to truly understand what kind of labor it takes to recruit and retain students in each, you know, department and discipline. So yeah, so the merger card campaign was super important for advancing that.
Yeah, thank you for laying that out, because I think folks who are outside of the academy might not understand exactly how radical and important this strategy is towards trying to create a kind of solidarity across employee classifications.
Can I just add something?
Yeah, please do.
On the note of meritocracy that Sebastian brought up, I do think that's another really important piece that we're trying to challenge here, is that the whole underlying kind of culture of academia is that, the smarter you are, the better you'll do. And so the people that have tenure because they're really smart and worked really hard. And the people that are adjuncts, well, that's just because they didn't, their dissertation wasn't as good, or they haven't published as many articles or whatever, and that they just got what they deserved. And that's absolutely untrue on like so many levels. We don't even have time to go into the whole way that meritocracy is created as this myth to produce and reproduce racial capitalism and patriarchy and whatnot in this quick interview. But that I think bringing all of these workers of different job categories together to fight in common for our working conditions also does a lot of work to break down this myth, right? That people are better than, right? And in fact, like Sebastian said, in many cases, it's quite the opposite in terms of, what's actually needed to run the university. And so, yeah, I think that's something that we've noticed is also, it's an ongoing struggle, right? For us all coming together in solidarity, right? That's work that we have to do. That's not something that just happens, but it's very, very necessary towards disrupting this idea that, the people who are at the top of the academic hierarchy are there because they deserve it.
Yeah, thank you. That's brilliant. So the phrase equal pay for equal work kind of leads into my next question. It's a phrase that resonates with people who have followed the efforts forever for the women's movement to create some kind of pay equity. And I noted, I think it was in 2019, which I believe is when your union also nearly went on strike, there was some fairly progressive provisions in your contract about trying to sort of eradicate, or eliminate, or reduce wage equity based on gender and I believe race. And I noted that your bargaining team and union put out this really terrific statement recently in solidarity with teachers and students in Florida who are facing this massive attack from the state and from DeSantis administration against wokeism and trying to outlaw the teaching of ethnic studies and disability studies and queer studies. And I wanted to just read the statement and ask you a question about it. The statement from your union said, "We, the full-time faculty, graduate workers, librarians, postdocs, and counselors at Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, express our solidarity with the students, educators, and education workers of Florida as they fight back against an extremist right-wing campaign to undermine public education from kindergarten all the way through higher education." So to what extent, if at all, do these issues of, let's call it gender discrimination, sexual discrimination, race discrimination, are they active motivators in your current campaign struggles on campus? And are they real lived experiences for people on the campus that are being included in the union campaign?
I personally know of colleagues who are senior, very, very comfortably tenured at the rank of full professor, who would fit the criteria of being significantly underpaid, despite having pound for pound, year for year, the same exact amount of sweat equity. And it is, there are some, the sociological dimension to it is profound. From the very start of one's career, that kind of the orientation to how you negotiate that type of HR level capital, on how to approach the offer letter, all of that is in part driven by networks, type of advisor, type of socialization, the sort of hidden curriculum in the process, and then those differences magnify over time. But it's also the case too that if you hold admin's rhetoric to reality, where Rutgers, New Brunswick is not supposed to be this sort of fiefdom or this like central titan that occasionally gives little crumbs and little pieces to Camden and Newark, that's something that the administration optically cares about very much, but practically the dollars and cents of it underscore kind of a really dystopian cake, multi-layered cake, where across departments you have pay gaps, across racial, ethnic, and gender categories you have pay gaps, and then obviously across campuses you have pay gaps, despite the fact that Newark and Camden have programs that meet the neoliberal cash cow designation, where they generate lots and lots of dollars for the institution, but the pay equity and the pay imbalances are an issue. There's been a lot of media coverage on this, where our current president acknowledges that adjunctification is an issue, but yet defers on the question of pay equity. And I think the quote was, open quote, "It's complicated," end quote. And when you pair that with phrases like the university must have, quote, "dominion over its data," end quote, I think that just speaks to the obfuscation or the muddying of the water to make sure that it's as techno-bureaucratically complex to the common observer, but it's really quite simple. It's that the university knows there's a fundamental issue about pay equity and is choosing to make it seem like, oh, there's just absolutely nothing that we can do to figure that out and to remedy that, which adds another layer of demoralization to what it's like to work here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I just want to historicize that a little bit, because I think that anyone that right now is fighting for public education, period, to educate all young people and to fairly pay all of your educators, that innately is a fight for racial and gender justice. Because schools, public schools, private schools, we won't even get into, but public schools, K-12 and higher education, have never been designed to actually treat all people equally, right? They've, for almost the entire history of the nation, have been designed actually explicitly to produce and reproduce, right, a straight, cis, white, male, elite class, right, and to limit the educational opportunities of everyone else accordingly. And so that's been the historic mission of schooling in the United States. And it's only quite recently, within the last several decades, that various civil rights and feminist movements and whatnot have pushed up against that successfully, right, and have managed, right, to expand, right, the type of schooling that's available to people and types of employment that's available to people. And so particularly in the case of universities, right, it's really only in the 1970s that a lot of universities started to become, right, open to a lot of students of color and faculty of color. And that wasn't because the universities decided out of their own largesse to do it. It was because they were pressured to do it predominantly by organized student movements. Newark, there was a massive movement by the Black Organization of Students in 1969 that led to a lot of these openings. That was in 1969, and we've seen the wheeling back of those victories ever since, right? And so the number of faculty of color at Rutgers have been declining over the past several years, even as, right, we're celebrated as like an incredibly diverse campus and whatnot. And you can feel it. I mean, in my program, there's a disconnect, because you can feel how we teach all of these histories of anti-racism and anti-capitalism and gender justice, but the professoriate is still predominantly white, and you feel that disconnect. And I think in our program, we've done a pretty good job of recruiting predominantly students of color over the last several years, and predominantly women of color, but they struggle to find advisors. And there's a huge burden on faculty, particularly women of color, to serve as the advisors for students of color so that they can, right, identify with a lot of these struggles that Sebastian was noting and sort of mentor them. And so that's another sort of unpaid labor, right, that's put already on top of faculty who are systemically underpaid, right, compared to their other colleagues. And so And so this is sort of the ongoing fight. I feel like we're just sort of picking up the baton from the students in the 1960s and 70s that like tried to open the door a little bit. We're seeing the door being closed again, even though while it's rhetorically remaining open, and trying to just continue this movement towards actually the ideal of equitable education. And yeah, Florida gets a bad rap, and obviously we stand in solidarity with educators in Florida, but New Jersey's record on racial justice is not great either.
So that leads me into another question I wanted to ask you, which is sort of step back a little bit and think. Can you tell me a little bit about, you both work on social justice, right? In your scholarship, I'm sure in your classroom. We have this thing called social justice unionism we talk about sometimes, where we actually try to highlight exactly the kinds of questions you're talking about, which are not just bread and butter issues, but issues of racial equality and gender justice. What does it feel like to be going on strike possibly to 2023 when, we're in the wake of like a ongoing Black Lives Matter movement? Your campuses serve working class, large student bodies of color, many of them, I'm guessing, first generation college students, right? Do they have a sense, do they have a stake in what you're doing? Do you feel like they're aware and understanding? Do you talk with them about what these issues feel like to you as teacher workers? And do you also have a sense of your own solidarity with like people in labor struggles in Amazon and Starbucks across the country who are basically trying to do what you're trying to do too, which is strengthen the power of unions? So it's kind of a broad question, but I'm interested in how you perceive from a macro kind of perspective what's actually happening at Rutgers right now.
Well, it's kind of, I come from this from a, it's my 5th year at Rutgers, and my department, my home department, Latino and Caribbean Studies, has a very Rutgers-specific history. And the department owes its very existence, its genesis to under 20 students who organized and really raised hell to advocate for a Puerto Rican studies curriculum to challenge the very kind of top-down, stiff, outdated, not low-key, but high-key racist portrayal of Latinos and Puerto Ricans in particular. And so undergraduate students organized to make the department, exist. And I think what I get the sense of is, I think the COVID pandemic looms quite large in ways that we can audit, but also ways that we've yet to fully appreciate because we're still kind of in it in a way, and we don't have that kind of distance yet, where we saw how things that seemed like they could never change just changed almost like right overnight. And also the many, I wouldn't say paradoxes, but the insulting contradictions of what an essential worker means and what they're paid. And like highly specialized surgeons, reducing their workload is one thing. Grocery stores that don't have human beings to reshelf or restock, that affects, a much broader group of people. Not to compare, different kinds of human value, but on that essence of what's essential and what's luxurious, I think that came to the fore. A big emphasis that has always been there, as part of the prior contract campaign, specifically, is working conditions equal learning conditions. And I mean, it speaks to what we spoke about earlier, and that Erin emphasized, that the kind of labor and the kind of pedagogical work that various different quote unquote classes of faculty do directly map onto what students get or fail to get, and what they appreciate or fail to appreciate, in their university experience. So anecdotally, subjectively, a lot of the students that are in my own classes readily get it and understand that we're in a moment inside and way beyond higher ed where if you don't put up a fight, you'll basically get run over, that you'll be paid as low as you possibly can unless you like really organize and articulate the fact that without you, the worker, there is no business. And so I think that that looms quite large. Though some of the administration's messages have sought to pit students and really parents against the union and kind of say, oh, or even worse, to say budget cuts are coming because we actually have to pay, workers living wages. We anticipate having to cut budgets because we have to pay people like a more coherent, ethically coherent wage. That's just part of a strategy to distract and to try to respond to the unequivocal fact that we're really all on the same team here, and it's quite obvious. Like when you know what Rutgers has in their coffers, and you realize that they're withholding it just because they can, that makes it super easy, and also quite comical to see that the best argument that administration has is, I don't even know. They truly have no argument other than we may have to punitively respond by cutting budgets because we have to pay like people who make $30,000 a year a little bit more money in the future so that they might like be able to make ends meet in the greater metro New York area, like Erin emphasized.
Awesome, thanks.
Yeah, and I would just add that I think, in addition to workers getting squeezed, students and their families, whoever's paying for higher education is getting as squeezed. Anyone that pays for higher education in the United States is struggling to pay for it. Again, unless you have independent sources of wealth or family wealth. And you go to pretty much any other country, especially quote unquote developed countries, and everyone else thinks it's bewildering the amounts of money that people in the United States are expected to pay for public education, right? Rutgers is the state university. And so the threat that the university constantly likes to, throw down is either budget cuts or raising tuition, which is essentially a pay cut for whoever's paying for tuition. Essentially. So it's like, well, we can either pay our workers, but then cut the effective salaries of our students, right? One or the other, but we can't do both. And we know they can do both, right? Because we've seen the numbers. And so I think that the sources of solidarity are fundamental because, students are paying way, 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 way more than they should be for an education. And the money is not going to where they think it is, which is to pay for their instructors, who are the predominant people that they interface with on a daily basis in the university. And a lot of those students are also workers in a lot of these industries that you named, right? They also work at Amazon, or they also work at Starbucks, right? So it's not like a separate group of people. We had a political education session in Newark at our most recent action, where we were literally talking about, why strike matters for Newark and the complicated, fraught relationship between Rutgers and Newark as a predominantly Black city, and how, Rutgers is not generally seen as a good actor by a lot of local residents, right? Because that, access to the university is not easy. And the university is, a landlord that displaces lots of local residents when it needs to expand for its own purposes, and rents go up and things like that. And so this idea, like Sebastian was noting, that, the bosses are not looking out for our interests is something that's been a much easier sell, right? Not only due to the pandemic, but I think just for, younger generations in general living sort of in this era of recession. But I think that for students, particularly at a public university, it's once you start talking to them, and we have been more and more and more, it's really not a tough sell, right? They see pretty immediately how, it's not great for them to have instructors who they don't know are going to be around the next semester, right? Or they don't know if they can really meet them on campus because they have to be running off to 5 different campuses, right, to make ends meet. They look at graduate workers and where are their future, right? They're told they should aspire, if they, are really on an academic track, they should aspire to go to graduate school and aspire to get a PhD. But then the PhD students that they interface with can barely make ends meet. So that makes that feel like not a possibility for them, right? Let alone a career in academia. I mean, as a person who's hopefully going to finish my degree this year, I mean, I am well aware of the fact that there is a minute chance that I will ever get a tenure track position because universities just aren't creating them anymore, right? Like my future, if I want to teach at a university, is most likely to be an adjunct part-time lecturer. And therefore, for me, like solidarity with part-time lecturers is like solidarity with my future. And I think that for undergraduates, there's that sense too of like standing in solidarity with their own future opportunities, particularly if they're interested in careers in higher education. So I think that those grounds for solidarity are there once you really start talking, and it's the talking that's important. We've had so many people in our union kind of asking like, am I allowed to talk to my students about this, right? There's this sense of it being potentially verboten, right? And not only are you allowed, like, please do, right? We encourage people to be constantly talking to their students, particularly over these next several weeks, because if we have to go out on strike, it's for our students, right? And we want our students to be out there, not standing in solidarity with us like in a one-directional thing, but like all of us standing in solidarity with each other, right? For a university that is actually, right, invested in public education and putting its money towards public education. And I think regarding some of these other industries that you've mentioned, this issue of the meritocracy comes up too, right? Where I think people in academia really often, I mean, we are raised in our whole educational system, we're raised to think that we are smarter. That's the whole like culture of academia. And so this idea that unions, some people don't even think unions should be a thing for academics necessarily, because, well, if you're just smart enough, you should get paid what you deserve. Thankfully in Rutgers we have a very long standing union, so we don't confront that too much. But that there's actually a lot for us to learn from the ways in which workers who at Amazon and Starbucks and in transit and elsewhere have organized successfely to accomplish things that are actually far more ambitious than anything we're trying to accomplish right now at Rutgers. And so we've started to have some of those conversations. We need to have more of them.
Great, thank you. Well, that kind of leads into my last question or consideration, which is we've been talking about different forms of solidarity that you've been building through this campaign. What would you say is, in your assessment, the key to kind of strong labor solidarity on a neoliberal campus these days? And if I could tag one part onto that question, folks who might be listening or reading this transcript tonight, anything that they could do to particularly show their own solidarity with the Rutgers struggle? Could either of you speak to that?
Well, I guess on the first question, I mean, this kind of picks up with what I was just saying, but I think that to me, the way that you build solidarity under neoliberalism is through kind of breaking all these rules, right? That it like sets out as just sort of common sense, right? There's this like common sense that we are, taught that, well, there's only so much money, there just isn't enough money, right? And money doesn't grow on trees, right? Like these kinds of aphorisms. And then when you actually start poking and doing the research, you're like, oh, actually, I mean, it does not grow on trees, literally, but there is so much of it. Like there is more than enough money, right? Like that's not the issue, right? So then, well, if money's not the issue, then what is the issue, right? And so then you kind of poke deeper, and then, oh, well, maybe there's a lot of money, but we, can't give everyone the same amount because, people work harder. And if you don't, incentivize people to work harder for more money, then they just won't work hard enough, because people are inherently lazy, right? We need to like motivate them to work with the threat of poverty. Well, again, once you start talking to people who have experienced poverty, for example, or other, you know, economic precarity, you realize, well, that's not true, right? Like people actually want to just like live a decent life, and they want to contribute, right, to their communities and their societies and just like survive collectively. And, you know, poverty is like constructed, right, to enable, right, this hoarding of wealth at the top. And so when you start poking at these common sense notions of why that essentially justify why some people are incredibly wealthy and other people, in fact, the majority of people are not, you start to peel away, right, at the fictions, but that requires the having of those conversations, because I mean, one of the things that underlines all of this, right, is racial and socioeconomic segregation. Because if you're only talking to other people who have had the same sort of economic and social experience as you, then yeah, it's reinforcing. And so by starting to have conversations, right, between undergraduates and faculty and full-time faculty and part-time faculty and graduate workers and people from different backgrounds who have like come to the university from all different places, and people who, you know, didn't get into the university, right? People who go to the local community college because they didn't get into Rutgers, right? Or people who just like live nearby and have been fighting Rutgers for years to just like, you know, make it prevent, you know, their neighborhood from gentrifying or things like this. So once you start having those conversations, that's when I think you can start to both peel away at these fictions that justify incredible wealth and poverty, but also to then build those relationships, right, which enable people to stand together. Because the thing is that, like Sebastian said at the beginning, like management's tactic is a war of attrition, right? They can afford very easily to wait us out. And there's a lot of legitimate fears that people have about going on strike, about standing up, you know, and because there are material threats to their existence in order to do so. You know, it's to management's benefit to drag it out as long as possible, and it hurts us to drag it out as long as possible. And so in order to build up, you know, the collective courage to stand up against these forces and to take risks, right, and to be able to lean on each other in the face of those risks, right, it requires the building of those relationships. And that's all long-term work. You know, that's not something you can just do for a campaign and then like drop it. And so I think that, you know, we're trying to do as much of that work as possible through things like bargaining for the common good across the 3 campuses and building undergraduate solidarity. But it's certainly an uphill battle because all of the incentives are the opposite, right? Are to convince people that there's legitimate reasons for them to be separate, and that at the end of the day, they just need to like look out for themselves, because that is how the system is set up. And so we have to kind of create this alternate reality in which we feel comfortable, right, really leaning on each other and sort of being the type of community we actually wish our society currently was. And in terms of concrete ways, I know that the adjunct unit has a strike fund already. I'm not sure if the full-time unit strike fund is up yet, but we can definitely get you those links and that information. And I think honestly, contributing to any strike fund, I'm sure there are others going on, is a great way to show solidarity with workers and give workers the courage to just hold out.
We'll definitely post those. Thanks. Wow, Sebastian.
Thank you, Erin. Yeah, that I'm in total alignment with Erin's points. So Erin emphasized the role of courage, and I guess the backdrop of that is various cultures of fear that are so contrived and so really not arbitrary, because they're there for a reason. They're there for the benefit of the status quo, which is that stratified, compartmentalized, segregated, and, you know, the very premise of thinking of people as types of workers, really as types of value, types of like what someone should be paid. And I think it's important to identify that the cultures of fear are pervasive across the entire university community. There's pervasive fear among our students who increasingly take on lots of debt, whose parents are working, who knows how long and how hard to be able to make Rutgers tuition, possible. And so you get all this kind of messaging early on to not rock the boat, to not raise any alarms. And it's truly, I mean, organizational sociologists have looked at the really life or death consequences of this. This goes into like medical errors. I mean, quite literally the Challenger explosion, like NASA, like people, it's, Erin emphasized this earlier, that people's lives are played with, and cultures of fear play a role in perpetuating systems that play with people's lives. I think that the time is quite robust across the country for workers asserting the power that they have. There's the energy for knowing that what really makes a business run are the people who actually work. Working people make things run. And also, if you think of the romanticized, utopian, idealized version of a university with its art and its music and its life and its theater, it's almost like any robust city, like, oh, how refreshing. You never know what kind of music you'll hear in the subway, or you'll never know what kind of like public theater performer is going to be there. And if you do what Erin emphasized, which is just have basic conversations about our material needs, you'd like to know that the person who volunteers 6 hours a day to play the saxophone standing up doesn't have to worry about how they can afford an annual trip to the doctor, right? If you're in the university, you don't want to have to worry about whether your instructor or your faculty member, the person who teaches the class out of love for the subject, is like really struggling to pay rent because their health insurance premium is through the roof. And you certainly don't want to replicate a tenure stream system where associate and full professors squeeze every ounce of both like understandable and totally non-understandable forms of labor from their assistant professors, knowing very well that it's a, put up with it or you're out type of messaging. And so across the university, you get all these different types of cultures of fear that, if you, to Erin's point, just peel the onion back a tiny bit, you see just how incredibly like management centric those cultures are, and how they're so fragile. They're so easy to undo, to the point where the best message that the university president could come up with is that we need a contract that's fair, reasonable, and responsible. And, to that end, look no further than the contract campaign, where what we're asking for is fair, it is reasonable, it is responsible. No one is asking for bike lanes or an entirely new subway station or iPads for every faculty member, or RUIDs get you access to the, what's it called? The premium, some premium gym membership or med spa. We're literally asking for the most basic material needs. And when management consists of people who make 400,000 plus, and you have to wonder, like, what do they literally do all day but simply take the heat for making really terrible, unethical decisions? Is that what, I mean, is that the cost? Is that what you're paid for, basically, to be the talking head that is the face of, a lack of a moral compass? Like, is your job literally just to care about the bond rating, or like to show how much extra money you added to the coffers? If that's literally it, that's not a type of labor sweat equity that carries any kind of real currency, for the people who actually make Rutgers work, the people who drive the buses that take students places, the people who clean up after very large events and gatherings, the people who work in, in selling food and drinks, the people who like make sure that when a facility needs maintenance and repair, it gets done. And obviously your teaching and instructional faculty as well. So it's been super refreshing. We're in a very privileged place to be that obviously has a lot more work that needs to be done, but that labor tradition at Rutgers is part of that, that aspirational commitment to being the best kind of institution that it can be. And to that end, we'd urge the administration to just look at our contract campaign, what our demands are, and find that they're fair, reasonable, and responsible. And any private sector consultant doesn't take one of the big four consulting firms to tell you. Any place that pays its people well and has good benefits has a productive workforce. So like our interests are actually aligned. The university performs on its key metrics of research, teaching, and service when its community is well supported, its material needs are met, and people don't feel disrespected, denigrated, devalued, and depreciated. It's truly not rocket science. So, yeah.
That's brilliant. Thanks, both of you. I think what's inspiring to me is, I think you're laying out a way of thinking about a strike like this as a whole way of imagining a different kind of university and more broadly, different kinds of social relationships, that can fall from that different university. So all of us at Puntorojo are on board and fully supportive of this strike. We will do our best to give folks, readers, opportunities to support you when we go live with this piece. I'm really grateful for both of you for taking the time tonight. I know you're crazy busy, but really illuminating, and for me, like a great textbook way of thinking about the challenges of building a strong union right now on university campuses. So thank you so much.